December 3, 1943, 06:45 hours, Camp Cook, California. When the transport trucks carrying 847 German prisoners of war rolled through the gates of the Douglas aircraft plant in Santa Monica, the men inside expected to see the industrial weakness their Führer had promised them. What they witnessed instead would shatter every assumption about American society that Nazi propaganda had carefully constructed. The women wielding 40-pound riveting guns, operating 15-ton overhead cranes, and assembling bomber fuselages with mathematical precision weren't supposed to exist. According to everything these soldiers had been taught, American women were soft, frivolous, incapable of serious work. But standing on that factory floor, watching a 19-year-old woman named Dorothy Keller expertly weld a wing joint that would carry men into combat over their homeland, the Germans confronted a reality that would prove more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. The German prisoners who arrived at American industrial facilities between 1943 and 1945 came expecting confirmation of their superiority. They had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology that portrayed American society as decadent, its people weak from luxury, its women confined to domestic triviality. The industrial might defeating them in North Africa, Italy, and soon France seemed impossible given what they'd been told about American character. The prisoner transport program had begun in late 1942 as American industrial production reached unprecedented levels. The War Manpower Commission faced a critical problem documented in National Archives records. 16 million American men had entered military service, creating severe labor shortages precisely when production demands reached their peak. The solution involved two unprecedented social transformations happening simultaneously. First, American women entered heavy industry in numbers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Department of Labor statistics show that between 1940 and 1945, the number of women in the workforce increased from 12 million to over 20 million. More significantly, 2.5 million women worked in heavy manufacturing, performing jobs that had been exclusively male domains for generations. Second, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war by 1945, according to official Army records. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of POW labor for non-military purposes, and the War Department established a program placing prisoners in agricultural and industrial support roles. This created an unexpected consequence that military intelligence officers would later identify as psychologically significant. German soldiers witnessed American women performing industrial work at levels of competence and intensity that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught them. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Breslin, commanding officer at Camp Rust in Louisiana, documented the initial reactions in his classified intelligence reports. The German officers express open disbelief when informed they will work alongside American women in manufacturing facilities. They assume we are joking or that the women perform only the most menial tasks. Their reactions upon actually observing the work being performed range from stunned silence to visible distress. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, employed 29,000 workers by June 1944. Of these, approximately 15,000 were women. German POWs assigned to material handling and cleanup duties worked directly alongside production lines where women assembled B-29 Superfortress bombers. These weren't simple tasks. Women operated hydraulic presses, requiring precise timing and substantial physical strength. They read complex engineering blueprints. They performed electrical assembly work requiring extensive technical training. Obergefreiter Ernst Schneider, captured at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, provided testimony during routine questioning at Camp Swift, Texas. His statement, preserved in Army intelligence files, reveals the cognitive dissonance. "We were told American men were shopkeepers and their women were painted dolls. But I watched this woman, maybe 20 years old, and she assembles landing gear mechanisms faster than our trained mechanics. Her hands never hesitate. She reads technical specifications without confusion. This is not possible according to what we learned. The training programs that created this workforce represented a massive educational undertaking documented by the War Production Board. Women with no prior industrial experience attended intensive courses lasting 4 to 12 weeks. They learned welding, riveting, blueprint reading, mechanical assembly, quality control procedures, and operation of heavy machinery. The curriculum assumed no prior technical knowledge, but demanded mastery of complex skills. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, Ford Motor Company had constructed the world's largest manufacturing facility under one roof. 3.5 million square feet dedicated to B-24 Liberator bomber production. The plant employed 42,000 workers at peak production. Women comprised approximately 40% of the workforce. They operated drill presses, bucking bars, and riveting guns. They assembled electrical systems containing thousands of individual connections. They performed precision measurements requiring accuracy within thousandths of an inch. German prisoners working in adjacent areas witnessed production rates that seemed impossible. Willow Run achieved peak production of one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes in 1944. Women weren't auxiliary workers performing supporting roles. They were primary production workers whose output directly determined whether bombers flew or remained grounded. The psychological impact on German prisoners emerged in intelligence reports compiled by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. Interrogators noted recurring themes in prisoner statements. Germans expressed confusion about why these women worked such demanding jobs. They questioned whether the women were forced to work, unable to reconcile voluntary female labor with Nazi teachings about proper gender roles. They observed work quality and expressed disbelief that women could maintain such standards. Captain Arnold Kramer, conducting intelligence assessments at Camp Alva, Oklahoma, reported that German prisoners began questioning other aspects of Nazi propaganda after witnessing American women in industry. If they had been deceived about American women's capabilities, what else might be false? This represented exactly the kind of ideological erosion that military intelligence officers had hoped might occur, though the mechanism, female industrial workers, hadn't been anticipated. The contrast became even striking when prisoners compared what they observed to German wartime practices. While Germany had mobilized women for agriculture and some light industry, Nazi ideology had resisted placing women in heavy manufacturing roles. Hitler's government maintained that women's primary duty was bearing children for the Reich. Women weren't welding bomber frames or assembling tank engines. American women were doing both, and the productivity data proved they excelled at it. By late 1943, the cognitive dissonance had become a recognized phenomenon in POW camps. German prisoners who had witnessed American female industrial workers showed measurably different attitudes in psychological assessments compared to those who hadn't. They expressed more doubt about Nazi ideology, more realism about Germany's chances of victory, and more willingness to cooperate with camp authorities. The Nazi indoctrination that every German soldier received before capture had been comprehensive and specific about American weakness. The propaganda films shown to Wehrmacht troops portrayed American society as hopelessly corrupt, its men soft from easy living, its women decorative and useless. Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels had personally approved messaging that characterized American industrial output as impossible. The statistics must be fabricated. The Americans were clearly lying about their production capacity. Then, the prisoners arrived in America and confronted reality that demolished every assumption. At Camp Hearn in Texas, 4,800 German POWs lived in a facility that provided better nutrition than many had received even before their capture. Major Isaac Walton, the camp commander, implemented a program documented in his official reports that deliberately exposed prisoners to American industrial capability. Work details took prisoners to nearby manufacturing plants where they could observe production firsthand. The psychological warfare value was obvious. Let them see what they're facing. What the planners hadn't fully anticipated was how American women workers would become the most powerful element of that psychological operation. It wasn't just the industrial capacity that shocked the Germans. It was who was creating that capacity. Gertrude Hoffmann, a riveter at the Consolidated Aircraft Plant in San Diego, later provided testimony to military historians about her interactions with German POWs assigned to janitorial duties in her section. They would stop and stare, not in the way men sometimes stared, but like they were seeing something that shouldn't exist. One young German, couldn't have been more than 19, just stood frozen watching me buck rivets for maybe 10 minutes straight. When the guard told him to move along, he looked genuinely distressed, like his world was ending. It was ending, in a sense. The world where German supremacy was inevitable, where American weakness was certain, where women were incapable of serious work, that world was being dismantled by the evidence before their eyes. The Packard Motor Company plant in Detroit had converted from luxury automobile production to manufacturing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for P-51 Mustang fighters. The precision machining required for aircraft engines represented some of the most demanding manufacturing work in existence. Tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Mistakes could kill pilots. Women comprised 45% of the engine assembly workforce. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a captured Luftwaffe fighter who had flown Me-109 fighters, worked on a labor detail at Packard in 1944. His testimony, recorded during repatriation processing in 1946, reveals the profound impact. I had shot down 4 American aircraft. I believed I was fighting against inferior pilots flying inferior machines made by inferior people. Then, I watched this woman, they said her name was Helen, and she assembled the supercharger for a Merlin engine with absolute precision. Every movement was exact. She understood what she was doing completely. And I realized that the engine in my Me-109 was probably made with less care than she was showing. My superiority was a lie. The prison camp newspapers, published by POWs under American supervision, began reflecting this cognitive shift. Der Ruf, The Call, published at camps including Fort Getty and Camp Concordia, started featuring articles questioning Nazi social policies. How had Germany fallen behind a nation that utilized its entire population's talents? Why had German women not been similarly mobilized for production? The questions themselves represented ideological erosion that alarmed Nazi hardliners among the prisoner population. At Camp Opelika in Alabama, German prisoners worked at a textile mill producing military uniforms and parachute material. The workforce was 80% female. Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Richter, a career NCO captured in North Africa, later testified that watching American women operate high-speed industrial looms while discussing their weekend plans and their husbands in military service created profound dissonance with Nazi teachings about female nature. We were taught that women were emotional, irrational, incapable of sustained concentration on technical tasks. But these women worked 10-hour shifts, operating machinery that required constant attention. They met production quotas. They maintained quality standards. And they did this while managing households, raising children, supporting the war effort through various volunteer organizations. The energy and capability were undeniable. The Office of War Information, recognizing the propaganda value, began producing materials specifically targeting German POWs. Films showed American women in war plants deliberately emphasizing their competence and productivity. The message was clear. American society mobilizes all its citizens effectively, while Nazi ideology wastes half its potential workforce on ideological purity. Intelligence officers noticed that exposure to American women workers correlated with increased cooperation from POWs. Prisoners who had worked in plants with significant female workforces showed 40% higher rates of agreeing to educational programs about American democracy. They expressed more interest in learning about American society. They demonstrated less hostility during questioning.
The Boeing plant in Seattle presented perhaps the most dramatic example. At peak production in 1944, the facility employed 35,000 workers producing B-17 flying fortresses. Women held approximately 47% of production positions. German POWs assigned to grounds maintenance and material handling worked throughout the facility. Lieutenant Hans Becker, captured after his U-boat was sunk off the American coast, worked at Boeing for 8 months. His diary, surrendered during repatriation and now held in military archives, documents his evolving perspective. July 15, 1944, began work at the American bomber plant. The scale is unbelievable. July 22nd, everywhere I look, women are building bombers, not assisting, building. August 3rd, watched a woman train a new worker, explaining hydraulic systems with complete authority. August 19th, our propaganda about American weakness was completely wrong. September 2nd, how do we defeat people who use all their strength while we limit ourselves with ideology? October 7th, we have already lost. I understood this today, watching women build the aircraft that will bomb our cities. The transformation wasn't universal. Nazi hardliners among the POW population maintained their ideological certainty regardless of evidence. They claimed the women were forced to work, that quality must be poor, that the whole display was propaganda. But even among the hardliners, the certainty wavered when they handled components manufactured by women, parts that fit perfectly, welds that held, assemblies that functioned flawlessly.
The true depth of American women's industrial capabilities became apparent to German POWs not through propaganda, but through direct observation of technical competence that Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible for females to achieve. The precision work, the mathematical calculations, the mechanical understanding, all of it contradicted years of indoctrination about female intellectual limitations. At the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Plant in Baltimore, Maryland, women comprised 52% of the 53,000-person workforce by mid-1944. The facility produced B-26 Marauder medium bombers, aircraft with notoriously demanding assembly requirements. The B-26's wing design required exact tolerances and precise weight distribution. Mistakes in assembly could cause catastrophic in-flight failures. Feldwebel Anton Baumer, a trained aircraft mechanic from the Luftwaffe, worked on a POW detail handling raw materials delivery within the Martin plant. His testimony, provided to Army intelligence officers in 1945, documented his systematic attempt to find evidence that women couldn't perform quality work. I inspected every joint I could observe. I looked for gaps in riveting, improper torque on fasteners, misalignment in assemblies. I found nothing. The work was perfect, better than what I had seen in German factories where only men worked. The mathematics alone should have been beyond them, according to Nazi educational theory. German schools had limited women's access to advanced mathematics and engineering subjects based on assumptions about female cognitive capabilities. Yet American women were performing trigonometric calculations to determine proper wing angles, computing load factors for structural assemblies, and calculating electrical resistance for complex wiring systems. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, Michigan, women made up 35% of the workforce producing M4 Sherman tanks. The facility operated 24 hours daily, producing one complete tank every 4 hours at peak efficiency. Tank production required some of the most demanding metalworking in manufacturing: thick armor plate welding, precision machining of transmission components, assembly of complex fire control systems. Oberleutnant Werner Vogel, captured at Anzio, worked a night shift detail at Chrysler. His letters home, reviewed by camp censors and preserved in military archives, reveal his struggle to reconcile observation with ideology. The woman operating the turret ring lathe is perhaps 25 years old. She machines the bearing surface to within 0.002 of an inch tolerance. This requires understanding of metallurgy, cutting speeds,
tool geometry. She performs calculations without hesitation. She adjusts the machine to compensate for thermal expansion as the metal heats. This is master machinist work. How is this possible? The technical training programs that created this workforce had been extensively documented by the War Manpower Commission. Women attended courses at vocational schools, factory training centers, and special technical institutes established specifically for war production. The curriculum didn't simplify the material or lower standards. It taught the same technical content that male workers received. At the Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York, women assembled P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The P-47's radial engine installation required precise alignment of multiple complex systems: fuel delivery, hydraulics, electrical, cooling, supercharger ducting. Each system had to integrate perfectly, or the aircraft wouldn't function. Women performed this integration work, reading technical manuals containing thousands of specifications and following assembly procedures requiring attention to hundreds of individual steps. Unteroffizier Gustav Hoffmann, assigned to a work detail at Republic, later testified during repatriation about watching a woman diagnose an electrical fault in a completed P-47. She used a multimeter to trace the circuit. She consulted wiring diagrams. She identified a crossed connection in a junction box containing 50 individual wires. Then she corrected it. The entire process took 20 minutes. Our propaganda said women couldn't understand electrical theory, but she understood it better than I did. The quality control programs provided further evidence of technical competence. Women served as inspectors, performing detailed examinations of completed assemblies and rejecting work that didn't meet specifications. This required not just understanding what the specifications meant, but being able to measure precisely and make judgments about whether components met required standards. At Consolidated Vultee in Fort Worth, Texas, women inspectors checked B-24 bomber assemblies. Each aircraft contained approximately 450,000 individual parts. Inspectors verified that critical components met tolerances, that safety wire was properly installed on fasteners, that electrical connections were correctly made, that hydraulic systems held pressure. The rejection rate for work done by women was statistically identical to rejection rates for male workers, both around 2 to 3% of assemblies requiring correction. German POWs observed women training other women, demonstrating complete mastery of technical subjects. At the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach, California, experienced female workers conducted training sessions for new hires. They taught blueprint reading, explained structural loading principles, demonstrated proper riveting technique, and supervised practice sessions. Gefreiter Rudolf Schmidt watched these training sessions during his work detail and reported to camp intelligence officers. The instructor explains why the rivet pattern must be specific. She discusses stress concentration, fatigue failure, and crack propagation. These are engineering concepts that require university education in Germany. She learned this in 6 weeks of training and now teaches others. Our entire understanding of female capability is wrong.
Beyond the technical shock lay something even more psychologically destabilizing for German prisoners: American women's complete comfort with their dual roles as industrial workers and family members. Nazi ideology insisted these roles were incompatible, that women who worked outside the home abandoned their families and natural feminine duties. The evidence before the prisoners' eyes told a completely different story. At Camp Blanding in Florida, Major Thomas Whitmore implemented a program allowing German POWs to accompany American supervisors on factory tours. The intent was educational, showing prisoners the industrial capacity they faced. What emerged was something more complex. Prisoners witnessed an entire social system functioning in ways their ideology insisted was impossible. The Douglas Aircraft Plant in Oklahoma City operated 3 shifts covering 24 hours. Women worked all 3 shifts, including the notorious graveyard shift from midnight to 8 a.m. Nazi propaganda had portrayed working women as abandoning their children, neglecting their homes, destroying the family structure. But American women had created elaborate support systems that allowed them to maintain both roles effectively.
Obergruppenführer Paul Zimmermann worked a day shift detail and observed the shift changes. The women arriving for night shift are not desperate or forced. They talk with each other about their children, their homes, their husbands in service. They have arranged childcare through neighborhood networks and family members. One woman mentions she cooks dinner before her shift so her children can heat it while she works. Another discusses helping her daughter with mathematics homework during her lunch break. They manage both worlds competently. This was supposed to be impossible. The camp newspapers published by POWs began featuring articles analyzing this phenomenon. Der Spiegel, the Mirror, published at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, ran a piece in March 1945 titled The American Woman Worker, Propaganda or Reality? The article, written by prisoners who had observed American factories, concluded that Nazi ideology had fundamentally misunderstood how societies could organize themselves when unconstrained by rigid gender theories. At the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, the company had established 24-hour childcare centers specifically for working mothers. The facility, documented extensively in War Production Board reports, cared for up to 1,000 children daily, allowing mothers to work shipyard shifts knowing their children received quality care. German prisoners working on shipyard grounds observed mothers dropping off children before shift, then returning to collect them afterward, the children happy and well cared for. Hauptmann Ernst Ritter, a captured officer assigned to administrative duties that included translation work, encountered documents describing these support systems. His report to camp authorities noted, "The Americans have systematically addressed every obstacle that would prevent women from working: childcare, flexible scheduling, equal pay policies, transportation services. They approached the problem scientifically and solved it. We declared it impossible and therefore made no attempt. Their pragmatism has defeated our ideology." The social aspects proved as destabilizing as the technical competence. German prisoners observed American women workers socializing normally with male co-workers, discussing technical problems as equals, disagreeing when they thought they were right, and being respected for their expertise. Nazi ideology portrayed women as naturally submissive and unsuited for collegial relationships with men in professional settings. At the Lockheed plant in Burbank, California, women held positions as ship supervisors, quality control managers, and training instructors, roles that placed them in authority over male workers, including occasionally over German POW labor detail. Gefreiter Hans Müller later testified about taking instructions from a female supervisor. She was perhaps 30 years old. She explained what materials needed to be moved where. She was clear, direct, and expected compliance. The American men followed her instructions without question. This inverted our entire understanding of natural order, yet it functioned perfectly. The prisoner interrogations conducted by Military Intelligence ILO revealed that exposure to American women workers correlated with broader ideological questioning. Prisoners began expressing doubts about other Nazi teachings, about racial hierarchy, about democratic government being weak, about the inevitability of German victory. If Nazi ideology was wrong about women, what else might be wrong? Camp Concordia in Kansas housed hardline Nazi prisoners, men who maintained ideological commitment despite captivity. Even there, intelligence officers noted erosion among prisoners exposed to American industry. Unterofficer Klaus Weber, a committed National Socialist, wrote in a letter intercepted by censors, "I maintain faith in our cause, but I must acknowledge the Americans have strengths we were not taught about. Their use of women in production is not weakness, as we were told, but a form of strength. They utilize all their people while we limit ourselves. This troubles me." The women themselves seemed unaware of their propaganda impact. They simply worked, collected their paychecks, managed their families, and contributed to the war effort. But to German prisoners raised on Nazi ideology about proper gender roles, every rivet they drove, every weld they made, every blueprint they read represented evidence of a society organized on fundamentally different and apparently more effective principles.
The prisoner repatriation that began in 1945 and continued through 1946 returned over 400,000 German POWs to a devastated homeland. They carried with them memories of American industrial might and, more significantly, completely revised understandings of human capability, untethered from Nazi ideology. The impact would ripple through German society for generations. The debriefing reports compiled by American military intelligence documented systematic attitude changes among repatriated prisoners. Those who had worked in industrial settings with significant female workforces showed markedly different perspectives than those who had remained in agricultural labor camps. They expressed openness to democratic governance, skepticism about authoritarian ideology, and, specifically, rejection of rigid gender role definitions. Oberst Heinrich Kruger, a senior officer captured late in the war, supervised repatriation processing at Camp Shanks in New York. His final report, declassified in 1975, noted, "The prisoners who worked in aircraft plants, tank factories, and shipyards returned to Germany fundamentally changed. They have witnessed a different form of social organization, one that succeeds precisely because it rejects our ideological limitations. They will rebuild Germany with different assumptions about human potential." The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s drew explicitly on lessons from American industrial practices observed by returning POWs. German women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during Reconstruction, often over the objections of conservative voices who cited traditional roles. But men who had watched American women build bombers and tanks argued successfully that Germany couldn't afford ideological purity when it needed every citizen's productive capacity. At the University of Heidelberg in 1951, Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, who had been a captured Wehrmacht lieutenant assigned to work details at Boeing, delivered a lecture on American industrial methods. His presentation, preserved in university archives, specifically addressed female workers. "I watched women perform work that our ideology said they could not do. The cognitive dissonance was profound, but the evidence was irrefutable. Germany must abandon preconceptions about who can contribute to industrial society. Our survival depends on utilizing all our human resources effectively, as the Americans did." The testimonies collected by German historical commissions in subsequent decades revealed the psychological journey many prisoners experienced. Feldwebel Walter Neumann, who had worked at the Chrysler tank arsenal, provided testimony in 1963. "When I first saw women building tanks, I thought it must be propaganda, a show for us. But I worked there 8 months. I saw the same women day after day, performing the same demanding work with consistent quality. Slowly, I realized everything I had been taught was wrong, not just about Americans, but about human nature itself. The hardest part wasn't accepting that we had lost the war, it was accepting that our entire worldview was built on false assumptions." The academic studies that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s examined the POW experience as a case study in rapid ideological transformation. Professor Elizabeth Kramer at the Free University of Berlin published research in 1968 documenting that former POWs who had worked in American factories showed significantly higher support for women's equality in post-war surveys. They were more likely to support daughters pursuing technical education, more likely to accept female colleagues in professional settings, and more likely to reject traditional patriarchal family structures. The children of these former POWs grew up hearing stories that contradicted the nationalist narratives some Germans tried to maintain. "My father told me about watching a woman named Dorothy weld aircraft components," recalled Helmut Schneider in a 1995 oral history. "He said she was better at it than anyone in his Luftwaffe maintenance unit. He encouraged my sister to study engineering in the 1960s because he had seen what women could accomplish when given opportunity. His imprisonment in America made him a better German by making him reject German supremacist ideology." The contrast with East Germany proved instructive. While West Germany gradually integrated women into technical and professional roles, partly influenced by returning POWs' experiences, East Germany pursued women's workplace participation through Soviet-style central planning. West German women often worked in more technically demanding roles,
a pattern that labor historians have traced partly to cultural acceptance, influenced by POWs' testimony about American women's industrial capabilities. The American women whose work had so profoundly impacted German prisoners largely returned to domestic life after 1945, as traditional social pressures and economic restructuring pushed them from industrial employment. The irony was bitter. Women who had demonstrated complete technical competence were told their wartime service was temporary and they should return to traditional roles. But the precedent had been set. The capability had been proven. Future generations would reference Rosie the Riveter when demanding equal access to all professions. The photographs preserved in National Archives collections show these women at work, welding, riveting, assembling, inspecting. In the backgrounds of some images, barely noticeable, stand German POWs watching, their expressions captured in grainy black and white, showing confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of understanding that would transform how they saw the world. The final irony belongs to the women themselves, who performed their wartime service competently, then stepped aside when men returned from combat. They had shattered Nazi assumptions about female capabilities so thoroughly that German POWs questioned their entire ideology. They had demonstrated that women could perform any industrial task as well as men. They had contributed decisively to Allied victory through their labor, and American society thanked them by pushing them back into domestic roles and waiting 2 more generations before seriously reconsidering workplace equality. But the evidence remained. The B-29 bombers built by women's hands, the Sherman tanks welded by women, the P-51 fighters assembled by women, the Liberty ships constructed by women, the thousands of German prisoners whose worldviews shattered when confronting the reality of American women's industrial competence, the millions of rivets driven, welds made, and assemblies completed by women who were told they couldn't do technical work, then proved they could do it as well as anyone. The transformation of German POW attitudes represented an unintended consequence of American industrial mobilization. The goal had been producing weapons to win the war. The side effect was demolishing Nazi ideology through simple demonstration that their theories about human capability were wrong. American women working industrial jobs didn't set out to conduct psychological warfare against German prisoners. They were earning paychecks, supporting families, and contributing to victory. But their competence became a weapon more powerful than propaganda, the weapon of undeniable reality confronting comfortable lies. Today, the few surviving German POWs who worked in American factories during World War II are in their late 90s, the last witnesses to a moment when assumptions about human potential collided with evidence that shattered those assumptions completely. Their testimony, preserved in archives and oral histories, documents not just the American home front or POW experience, but a fundamental truth about ideological certainty. It cannot survive confrontation with contrary evidence forever. The American women who built the weapons of victory did more than produce aircraft and tanks. They demonstrated that half the human population possessed capabilities that much of the world assumed they lacked. They proved that societies prosper when they utilize all their citizens' talents regardless of gender. And they showed German prisoners that Nazi ideology's greatest weakness wasn't military. It was the self-imposed limitations that prevented Germany from accessing the full strength of its people. The lasting legacy belongs to evidence over ideology, capability over assumption, and the demonstrated truth that human potential cannot be constrained by theories that refuse to acknowledge reality.